we might still encounter potassium deficiencies. So when I run a soil test, I tend to run a water extract, or you might hear this as a pace extract, or a modified Morgan. There's different labs do it differently, but it's basically a water extract. So I tend to like to run those tests together whenever I'm doing it, because it gives me some insight into what's going to be available and what is. And I can look at both of those and help me make decisions. A lot of times you'll find potassium is okay available, but calcium is not at all. So even though we have lots of calcium in the soil, it's just not available. And that, like I said, can help you make a decision on how much more to add, maybe to invest in a foliar spray because your soil is just not releasing that calcium. So that's the first thing I'll say. Still run your soil tests, but some labs can help you dig a little deeper going into a water extract. The other thing I'll say about when I work with soil tests and with labs, it's you've got to make a decision of where you're going to pull these. Nowadays, grid sampling's become a lot popular. We'll run around with four-wheelers and we'll take lots of samples all over the place. That's wonderful. Sometimes I do that because I want to figure out what your variability is. So if I pull tests from many different spots, I can especially now put it on a computer, and I can really see maybe how through the vineyard the soil's changing, especially as we go up hills and down hills and on slopes. So that's wonderful, but unless you're going to variable rate spread fertilizer, it gives you some insight, but it's hard to manage. So typically when I do fields, we set up what I call high yield pods, or just pod testing. So what we end up doing is we find a spot within the vineyard, and maybe it's two. So it all depends on how big it is and just how much undulation is there. But we're going to set up a pod, and in that pod, we're going to usually go. I want to get at least 3 rows, right? So I'm usually using 1 row, and I'm getting samples on both sides of the row, and I'm going to a row next to it and pulling some samples in the row on the other side. And in that pod, and then I'm walking around, 20, 30 square foot area, and in that pod I'm taking all my soil. So I'm going to get a lot of soil from a small area, opposed to when we grid sample, we take just a few probes from one spot, we move on. We take a few probes and we move on. I like to get a lot of soil from one area because it gets out chances of variability. So we're using that space to take a lot of soil and get very good representation of that space. And then that pod becomes where we do all our sampling. So we used it for soil, but now that's where we come back to take our tissue tests. That's where we come back to maybe take our biological tests, which I'll talk about a little more down the road. Maybe that's a place where we'll come back to take some soil physical tests like bulk density or aggregate stability or other things we might want to do to dig a little deeper into our soils. So I highly recommend pod testing because of, one, the ability to take a lot of soil in a tight area, and that's been proven over and over by multiple universities is a good way to sample. But also, it just from a management standpoint, it's really great because now you've got one spot or maybe two that it's easy to go into the field. You can mark them. So maybe you can mark those spots, and it's really easy to go in and out of. Right where that spot is, and you're going to that spot every time. It's different when I work with corn growers, and we might be on 1,000 acres. Now we're GPSing sites so we can get back to that site. We're just open fields, open land. But when we work with row crop or tree fruit, it's a lot easier to mark our spots, and we go back to there. And it's really important though that we go back to those spots, because on one level, I want to know what all the minerals are doing throughout your field, but I also don't need that level of detail. I really want to know in these spots where those minerals are, and now I'm just comparing them over space and time. So I don't really, on some level, need to know that the potassium hold in this front corner a little better than it did in the back corner. Yeah, that is useful, but it's hard to manage. What I really want to know is in that spot, when I come back year after year, and I test, it's going to tell me something about my management decisions. Did that spot change? Did the potassium level go up? Did it go down? Did it stay the same? And that's how I'm going to judge how well I did. When I took the initial test and we made a recommendation, when I come back, it's going to tell me where I've done. And that's really what all I want to know, because if it changed in that spot, it changed everywhere. As long as you, there, is that better? Okay.
Yep.
So as long as your management is consistent, you know you're going in a positive or negative direction. The one thing about soil testing and a lot of things is that the numbers are great and we need them, but they can also drive you crazy trying to get them too perfect. Soil is a very dynamic place, and these things move. So we also don't want to go overboard with just taking too many tests all the time. The numbers, trying to get the numbers perfect is really difficult. We just want the numbers to trend in the directions we want it to go. If potassium is too high in a field, we want to see it falling because of how we've decided to make the new recommendations. So that's something I want to tell, and that's where pod sampling is great. And I think if we get into biological tests, which I'll talk a little bit more about, it's even more important for biological tests because they're very sensitive. And if you go through your field and take lots of samples, it's going to drive you crazy because that microbiome is going to be very different as you go across the field, and it's going to change throughout the season dramatically. So you start chasing things that get really difficult. So we just kind of want to find a spot and follow that spot, track that spot. So again, soil testing is really important to get that baseline of where our nutrients are in terms of volume. How much potassium do I have, and how saturated are my soils? From there, I usually step into the next thing. Biological testing has changed this a little bit, but traditionally the next step is to take some tissue testing. So how I view tissue testing is it's the report card to how well we've done. So if we take a soil test, and based on the soil test and based on what you're growing and what your yield goals are, we're going to come up with a fertility plan, and we're going to put that plan into action. The problem is with that soil test, again, is using a pretty strong acid, and it's telling us pure chemistry, but it's not taking into account what the microbiome is going to do. It's not necessarily taking into account your unique clay chemistry. So even though we can assume potassium might move this way, it might not, because we have a clay that wants to absorb and not release potassium. Or we might have a microbiome that's damaged to the point where it just doesn't release potassium like the textbook tell us it should. So we always need to take that soil test and follow it up with something to make sure what we did is actually getting into the vine. So that's where tissue testing comes in. It's the report card to how well we did. And it helps us see into the soil in a way that gets very expensive to test if we really want to test for clay chemistry and test for microbiology stuff. So I always follow it up with a tissue, and like I said, it's a report card. Then of course there's always questions of, well, what kind of tissue? Should it be a tissue test with a leaf blade? Should it be a petiole? Should it be a sap analysis? And the first thing I'll say is that they're all good. They're all beneficial. I've used all of them, and they all are numbers that can help you and guide your path. I tend to use much more leaf blade analysis when I do it, and the big reason is I'm looking at all the nutrients. So I'm looking at nitrates, total nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, all the micronutrients. When you do that, you really want to look at the leaf blade. Petiole testing is really wonderful for us to look at nitrates. It's good to look at phosphorus, but the other nutrients start to fall away. They don't correlate quite as well. So if we're using that petiole to just kind of track our nitrogen, which is really important, that's fine. But as I tend to look for other analytes, I go towards the blade. And why would I do that? So why would you want to look at other analytes? The main reason we're looking at other analytes is to make sure our nutrition is balanced, right? We need nitrogen, we need phosphorus, we need potassium. but we also need the micronutrients as cofactors to help make those nutrients be more efficient. So in today's world of high fertilizer prices and pretty much high every price, we need to make sure we're maximizing our fertilizer budget. So to do that, we got to make sure that our minor nutrients are keeping up with our macronutrients. So that's why I tend to take a leaf blade analysis, so we can look at, is zinc in a good relationship with nitrogen? Is copper in a good relationship to nitrogen? So that's really important.
RJ, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
We have some people over the Zoom, and I want to just ask people. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. There's a speaker here, and we can hear your voice. Yeah, feel free to just unmute. Yep.
Wonderful.
Sorry.
Yeah, and as we go along, I mean, we're here. It's interactive. So just if you have questions, ask. If I say something that doesn't quite that you have a question about, just feel free to jump in. Because I will just keep talking. If you ask anybody who knows me, I will just keep talking unless somebody stops me. So, so back to tissue testing. I like it. I tend to do a leaf blade over nitrate or over petiole. Sometimes I'll do both. So sometimes I will take the leaf and the petiole and I'll send them both in and I'll run a petiole for nitrogen, because typically with leaf blade you're going to get total nitrogen. And they're going to use something called a LECO machine, and we're going to get a total nitrogen that's going to look at ammonia, nitrate, and protein. So that's a good number. I really like to base a lot of my recommendations on total, not just nitrate. But that being said, I kind of want to know what nitrate is doing, and because that can drive a lot of disease and insect pressures. So we want to make sure we're not having these nitrate flushes. So the petiole's nice just to get that nitrate number, and we know that correlates really well. So a lot of times I'll just do both, and it's easy then because I can just pull the leaf and the petiole in one shot, put it in a bag, and the lab will separate it for me. So it just makes kind of that very quick and easy. The other thing you can do is sap analysis. So opposed to those two things where they're going to take that tissue and analyze all of it, sap is going to take that tissue and press it and get the sap out of it. Sap's become very popular, especially in specialty crops the last few years. I've done quite a bit of sap. You can learn quite a bit from sap. So let's talk about pros and cons real quick about sap analysis. You're going to get a lot of information. You're going to get the information of the nutrients that are about to load into the leaf. So you kind of get a small window into what's happening. So you can kind of be slightly ahead of maybe a deficiency that could be happening. So that's the good part. The other part is usually you take these samples from upper leaves and bottom leaves, so you're getting a little bit of insight into flow. So how are these nutrients flowing up and down? That can be some wonderful insight. The other thing is you tend to, with these samples, get a lot of analytes. So it's not just NPK and the micronutrients, they tend to also run molybdenum and cobalt and iodine and things like that, which are less important but can be hidden problems in a crop. So it's nice, especially for someone like me who analyzes a lot of data. I like extra data. So what's the downside? The downside is you get a lot of data. So that can be problematic because we have all this data. What do we do with it? The other thing is it is newer. So we have 40 years of data for sufficiency numbers with tissue testing. So that data is pretty sound. With the SAP testing, it's newer. So we're still building our data sets. So that data is something that it's a lot harder for me to talk about a sample that came out of northern Michigan with also a guy that might be growing vines in Ohio. As we move across regions, because we don't have big enough data sets, it's harder for me as a consultant to make calculations off of that. Now, where it is useful though is if you want to build your own data set. So, and this is useful for soil testing, for any kind of testing. The more testing you do on your farm, the more you're building your own data set. And that has power to it. And SAP can really build big data sets. Which leads to the other problem though. With SAP, because the plant is growing through its physiological stages so rapidly, your SAP results are going to show that. So the one problem is too many people take one SAP test pull a year, and that's what they're basing a lot of, and it's really not enough. If you're going to SAP test, you really need to take multiple pulls over the season and make sure you're getting pulls in all the physiological different stages of development, because they're going to change just on their own. When a lot of the sufficiency data for tissue testing is done, that's what they're doing. They're pulling SAP type analysis across the growing season, and they're crunching all those numbers for you. So they're kind of building that in. Sure, you get the highs and the lows, and you don't get quite as specific as you might want to, but it's really helping you take the peaks and valleys out and make better decisions. So if you really want to get into the weeds, that's where SAP testing is great. You can take many pulls throughout the season, and you can see the dynamic of that crop. You can see, zinc might be great all year except for right before veraison. Maybe it's crashing. And if it's always crashing, now you can make a management plan to address that. So that's where those types of things are powerful. The one thing I will say about SAP though is I think too many people pull a SAP and see maybe zinc, again, we'll stick with zinc, is a little deficient, and they run out right away and they buy a bunch of zinc and they spray it on. And I tend not to do that in my consulting, because we start to play these games of whack-a-mole where, yeah, I sprayed that zinc on, but maybe because I sprayed all the zinc, I pushed something else out of balance. So I tend to take tissue for a season or two and start building some data, and now we can start to trend it. Is zinc always deficient? Well, if I do it after 2 or 3 pulls and my zinc keeps becoming deficient, my zinc more than likely is deficient. And now if I make a change and I buy zinc and incorporate it in my program, I'm probably going to get a good return on investment. So I think we make too many knee-jerk reactions to a one-time test and a one point in time analysis. So, and it's another reason why when we start coupling a soil test with a tissue test and maybe a few other tests, we start to build a better understanding of what's going on three-dimensionally opposed to just this one-dimensional pull in time. So again, SAP's really good. It's a fun tool to use if you really want to pull a lot of tests and pull a lot of data. The other downside to SAP testing is there's another management layer. We really need to pull SAP tests kind of early in the morning, at least before noon. Once we get up into noon and the afternoon hours, photosynthesis is happening, it's starting to peak out, and SAP flows are going to be different, and it skews results. So you really need to pull those early. With tissue, we have a little more forgiveness there, so that's another reason why I like tissue. It's hard for me to be in Southwest Michigan in the morning and then up here in the morning. So as a consultant, when I'm pulling things, I need that flexibility. Sometimes for growers, we need that flexibility because it's hard for us to just go out and pull stuff. So that's just the one cautionary thing too. You got to really kind of pay attention to when you're pulling those tests, and really with tissue too, I like to be consistent. So if I'm pulling things at 10 in the morning, try to keep pulling them at 10 in the morning. You know what, if it's 9 in the morning, if it's 11, that's plenty good window. But if I'm pulling this round of tests at 9 in the morning and I pull the next round at 5 in the afternoon, there's going to be some data skewed there. Is it the end of the world? No, but they can be little differences that that confuse us as we start to put recommendations aboard. So we started with the soil, we went to tissue. I think people underutilize tissue testing. You should be pulling more tissue tests than soil tests, in my opinion. Because again, like I said, that's kind of the report card of what's going on with our soil tests. So before I go on, is there any questions kind of with those two?
Could we go back to pod sampling and picking
Yes.
the pod? And
Yep.
do you pick a neutral producing area that's in decline, or you need to improve, or do you separate those? And where do you start? How do you kind of start your baseline?
Yep, excellent question. So if everybody didn't hear, he talked about, he wanted to know more about pod testing and how to choose those pods, and should we choose, neutral sites or sites that we're having problem. And yeah, typically what we want to do is I want to go to spots in the field that are representative of the whole field. So I want to be in a spot that is very representative of how the whole field is acting and growing and the dominant soil type. So that's where I want to have my main pod. What I don't want to do is, have a pod in the low hole that isn't performing as well. Now I'm going to pull it there, and that's going to represent everything. I don't want to do that. So I want to be in a good representative spot. And then if I have really problem areas, I want them to be their own pods. So I'm going to sample those separately. And I don't always have to, because if they're just a little but not too bad, we can choose not to. And a lot of it comes back to management, because you can have pods all over the place, but if it's a block that is always just going to get sprayed the same, and you're not going to isolate those out and treat them differently, at some point it doesn't matter. So a lot of times if I have spots that are, okay, this back corner is a little different, it's not quite as big, that's not where I'm going to have my pod. I'm going to take my pod where it's most representative. We're going to make our decisions, and we're going to watch that bad spot. Hopefully the insights we get is going to not only improve the good, but also the bad. Now, if it's severe enough, that's when I want to definitely isolate it and try to figure out, well, what's going on there that's making it so bad. And now we have an opportunity to do that, because these tests, although are wonderful on their own, they're always better when I have something to compare them to. So I have an A/B. So now if I have a test for a field, but I definitely have a bad spot, that bad spot, if I just took it on its own, it might be hard to figure out what's going on. But when I am able to compare it to something that is performing well, those numbers start to mean a lot more to me as I'm going through that process of discovery. So does that help?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, picking those pods are important. And sometimes, we pick, a lot of times I will choose and have more pods in the beginning, and then slowly over time maybe some of them fall away as the field starts, as things start to match up, as the field starts to become more representative. And I'll say that about testing in general. I'm one of those people that I tend to pull a lot of stuff in the beginning, knowing that I'm going to slowly over time do less and less as we start to get a sample. But it's always better to have more data and pull it back, opposed to really being skimpy. Sometimes if you're going to be skimpy, maybe you just shouldn't be doing that new test. So more data is always better than less data. So we've talked about soil a little bit, we've talked about tissue. The next thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit is, we'll call it soil health testing or microbial testing. That's kind of the thing that's really come about in the last 5 to 10 years, and the thing that is probably still underutilized the most out there. There's quite a few tests on the market. I'll talk about a few of them. At the end of the day, when I go into microbial testing, the first place I start is with a respiration test. So that's the one that I always track down first and I like to see. So a respiration test is going to be, it's looking at CO2. So these are tests that are they're taking your soil, they're usually wetting it and drying it down, because that's what happens to your soil naturally. Your soil gets wet, it dries down, it re-wets, it dries down. So they're going to, go ahead, question?
Can you name the names of those first? Is that Haney?
So a lot of labs have different respiration tests. That's why I didn't name it in the beginning.
I just want to know.
Yep,
just
so
get an idea of what.
Haney test is one that does a respiration. And most of these respirations are going to be based on the 24-hour burst, which was the old Selvita test. Solvita's still around. I don't recommend Solvita because we've improved since then. But what happened was, it was really Rick Haney, and that's why there's a test called the Haney test. It was Dr. Rick Haney who figured out, we've always had respiration, but back in the day it was a 28-day basal respiration test. So the problem is, if it's a 28-day test, it doesn't mean much to the grower. By the time we take it and we get the results back, most of the season's gone. So what Rick Haney did, in his genius, is he figured out how to take all the data we had from respiration, because we've been doing respiration tests for a long, long time, I think into the 40s. We had all this data, we had all this knowledge. What he figured out how to do is, well, let's do it in a 24-hour pan, and he was able to correlate all that data with the 24-hour test. So now we can analyze it in 24 hours and utilize the data. So what data? Why are we going to use a respiration test? What's great about a respiration test is, in my mind, two things. It's not telling me what microbes are in my field. So it's not telling me, do I have bacterial dominated soils or fungally dominated soils? Do I have good nematodes or bad nematodes? It's not going to tell me who the players are, but it is going to tell me what the total biomass is. So it's going to give me an idea of how big of microbial biomass I have in my soil. So that's good. But it's also going to tell me how active it is. And that's the most important, because some soils we can have many, many, many microbes, but they're not active. And if they're not active, it really doesn't matter how big the numbers are. And in other soils, I can have a smaller microbial biomass, especially sandy soils. But if they're active and they're balanced, I still get a lot of productivity out of that microbiome. So respiration quickly tells me kind of how big my biomass is, and more importantly, how active it is. And that's really what I want to know. At the end of the day, I just gave a talk yesterday, and we analyze soil tests, we analyze tissue tests, and we're doing it for the analytes. We want to know what nitrogen is, and what phosphorus is, and what potassium is. Very important. But yield is correlated with water, and then also CO2. So if we don't have any water, it really doesn't matter. The crop's going to dry out and die. If we have too much water, it's going to drown. So water is very important, and that is the #1 yield predictor. So we can talk about soil tests till we're blue in the face, but if you control water, you control yield. Also, we need water to make photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is just water and CO2. So the next yield limiting thing is CO2. And CO2, again, is something, unless you're a greenhouse, I can't buy, but my soil manufactures. So the more microbial activity I have in the soil, the more oxygen they're breathing, like you and me, and the more CO2 they're respirating. And the more CO2 that's respirated down underneath your crop, your vine, well, now those leaves can grab that CO2, and hopefully they have enough water, they can photosynthesize. And it's that plant's ability to photosynthesize that's going to make it productive and healthy. And then in a much larger talk, we can talk about how if we have enough photosynthetic capacity, not only are we going to have a healthy crop that's meeting its primary needs, but it's got enough excess energy to push those root exudates, which are sugars and amino acids. They're going to put excess into the soil and actually build soil. So our crops are soil builders if they have the energy. And how we can track some of that is through respiration tests. So that's always the one I go to first. The other reason I go to a respiration test is back to before the 24-hour burst was created, we had basal respiration, and it tracked very well to nitrogen mineralization. So when we do a respiration test, I get some insight into how much nitrogen is going to mineralize out of that soil. Well, that's really important, because now it's not just me pulling a nitrate test and doing some math to try to estimate nitrogen release. It's not me just saying, well, I have 2% organic matter and the USDA estimates X amount of nitrogen release. Now I have it based on microbial activity. And it's a very strong correlation. And what you'll find is you go into different blocks, and one block might be mineralizing 30 units of nitrogen for the season. And you'll go into a block over here and it might be mineralizing 60. Well, that's a very test is they're going to give you a carbon and a nitrogen number. And there's kind of two dominant carbon numbers out there now. You're going to get potassium permanganate, which you'll find at the university level. If you use the Cornell Soil Health Assessment, which is another one you can use, they're going to use potassium permanganate. Or in the Haney test, they use a TOC analyzer, total organic carbon analyzer. You see those all over the place too. I tend to like the TOC analyzers a little better because it looks actually at a smaller amount of the carbon. Potassium permanganate tends to look at too much carbon, and some of it, I think it inflates how much carbon is actually available. So why are they doing this on this test? What they're doing, why they're giving you those carbon numbers is kind of back to, I just talked about water and CO2 being important to crops. Well, carbon is also another limiting factor that we don't think about. We think about adding nitrogen, we think about adding potassium. We've gotten much better over the last 10 years since I've been consulting. We've increasingly got better at knowing what crop removal is and how to replace what we've removed, right? If we took off X a ton of crop, we removed that amount of potassium, well, we better put that potassium back in some form, or at some point we're going to be so low on potassium we're going to have a yield impact. So we've gotten good at that. But what we haven't figured out though is, yes, you're removing potassium when your grapes leave the acre, but you're also removing carbon. So, and carbon is what is driving the whole microbial system. So if we want that applied fertilizer to actually become plant available, we need it to process through the microbial biomass. And a lot of times one of our limiting factors is carbon. There's just not enough carbon there to drive that microbial system, which leads us to what is carbon though? And carbon is a great big word. I have a diamond ring, that's carbon, but the microbes can't utilize it. But if I have this leaf here, well, that's also carbon, but that's carbon that a microbe can break down and use as energy. So what a Haney test is trying to do, or like a Cornell test that's using a potassium permanganate, they're trying to tell you of all the carbon in your soil, which you're getting in an organic matter test. So most of you have had soil tests, you've seen the organic matter. Organic matter is important, but that's giving you total carbon. So that's giving you the carbon that's breaking down and is still food to microbes, and it's also giving you the carbon that has totally been broken down through microbial decomposition and can't be broken down anymore. It's important, it's structural, it's still playing a role, but it might not be driving the biomass. And sometimes in soils, we'll have a field that works really well for a decade, and then all of a sudden it starts to become less productive. And a lot of times, it's just the soil test looks the same. Wow, I have soil tests from 10 years ago, I have a soil test from today, they look identical. Why do I have a lack of vigor? A lot of times, it's just we farmed it and carbon's left the system and we haven't replaced it because we haven't thought about replacing it. And now the microbes just can't process the nutrients that are there. The soil test proves they're there, the plant's just not getting them at a rate they were. So those tests, like the Haney, they're trying to give you a carbon number that's looking at carbon as pools now. So we have the pool of total soil organic matter, and then we have this pool of liable carbon, is usually the word that's used. That's liable carbon is just carbon that hasn't been fully processed yet. It's still food for microbes, and it's still driving microbial growth. So again, Haney test gives you that. So does Cornell. Go ahead, question?
Yes, sir. For the Haney test, what cost are we talking about, and how often should that be done per acre?
Good question.
Per year?
Yep. So Haney test right now, most places, there's 4 or 5 labs that do it, maybe more at this point. They're usually around $50 a sample. Cornell is at least that. It might be a little more. You get more things with Cornell, but you can kind of pick and choose too. So, so how often should you do it? It depends. That's a big question. I think you want to do it at least once a year, and potentially 3 or 4 times during the year. And it is different. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if I'm doing it 3 or 4 times during the year, what I'm trying to do is figure out what my microbial biomass is doing. Where does it start at the beginning of the season, and where does it go? Because what's going to happen is at the beginning of the season, your microbes are going to have a certain baseline activity. But then as the soil warms up, they're going to take off. And then as your crop starts growing, different things are going to happen. So I really like to take 2 or 3 samples throughout the year to see where's my high, where's my low, where does everything go. And what that does for you is it kind of tells you where your peaks are, tells you where your activity is at its best, and it's just a nice baseline to have. You don't need to do that forever, but it's a nice thing to know. If you don't want to get that intense, which most people don't, then we want to take just 1 a year. Personally, a lot of people take them in the fall. I don't. I tend to take them in the spring if I'm going to do it. And I want to do it in the spring before once winter's done, so we don't have snow on the ground anymore, but the soils haven't started warming up yet. So, at that point, my soil's just kind of standing there, ready to go, but it's not going yet. And to me, that's a great time to do it. One, it's early enough where I'm going to get those results back, and it might help me change some of my fertilizer that I'm going to do this year, because I'm going to get that respiration. I'm going to get a good idea of nitrogen mineralization, so maybe I tweak some things. But more importantly is I want to see where my soil is at that kind of base level microbial activity. And it's one of those times a year where it's going to be pretty consistent, right? My temperatures are going to be this way almost every year within a week or 2. And what I want to see over time, if my soil's improving, let's say my respiration rate is 30 parts per million carbon, because that's how it'll be represented, as parts per million CO2. Let's say it's 30 this year. Over space and time, that base level should come up. So as I'm improving soil, my resting respiration rate will come up over time. So
We cannot hear you now.
Oh.
Hey guys, I think we lost our speaker, so I'm gonna text Esmail. Just hang tight, okay? Oh, there they come.
Yep.
How about now? Is this better?
Yeah, we
Yes.
can see you now. We lost you for a minute there.
Okay. Okay, so if everything's good, so I want that baseline respiration to be improving over time, especially if I've changed managements, right? So we've decided we're going to now compost. We never composted in the past. I want to know before I start that what it is in the spring, and then hopefully over the next 2 to 3 to 5 years, that baseline rate should go up. It's not going to go up. You're not going to go potentially from a 30 to 100, but you should be seeing that. As long as that's going in a positive direction, I'm happy. I'm happy that the management choices are having a positive direction. If it's not, I can start asking questions as to why, and start maybe doing other things. So that's why I like it in the spring. The other thing too is if I then want to pull other tests for soil quality over long term. So I might want to pull an aggregate stability test to see, because that's one thing, as my soil improves, usually the ability for it to aggregate and be stable improves. I can pull bulk density. I can pull water holding capacity. These are all things that change, usually for the better, as my soil improves. Again, the time to pull those are that early spring. So I like that time because I can pull a lot of tests then that are applicable, and then typically that's when I'll pull my soil test too. So I can use that time to kind of do a lot of work in one pass. So that's why I like the spring. Fall in these systems would be fine too, but I tend to be more of a spring guy, especially when we do row crops, because I want to do it before we do any kind of tillage. Once we've got tillage, it's hard to kind of do in-season testing. We've really disrupted systems. So I want my soil to kind of have gone through a period of rest, and then that's the time to do it. So the other thing you're going to get with a Haney test is you're also going to get so we had a carbon number, we also have a nitrogen number, but they're trying to look at nitrogen as not just nitrate and ammonia, they're looking at it as protein. So you'll see that with a lot of tests now. Haney will have they call it organic nitrogen, but that's just looking at proteins. I believe with Cornell, they have an ACE protein test. So again, they're looking at proteins. There's other ways we can look at proteins with the soil, but looking at protein in the soil is a valuable tool too. So that's another thing that I look into, because if we're building a better carbon pool, we also want to be building a better nitrogen pool. And my nitrogen pool, I don't want it to just be nitrate. I want it to be amino acids too. Why is that? Nitrates are great, they're all fine and good, but the plant still has to process them. So the plant's got to take in nitrates, and it's got to use energy to convert them over to ammonia, and it's got to use more energy to convert that to protein. Ultimately, the plant is trying to produce protein. If we already have protein in the soil, the plant can pick up that protein and use it, and there's no energy conversion. So the more of that I have in my soil, the more I can actually use less nitrogen fertilizer and still produce growth, but it tends to be more controlled growth. We don't get these nitrate flushes. We get nice, good green color and steady growth. So especially in our sensitive crops, I want to be improving that protein pool. And now we've got tests that just, again, when we pull one, they're not going to tell you a lot. These are tests that the power of them is pulling them year after year for a few years and tracking what they're telling us. They're also meant to be used with a management program. So they're going to either assess your current management program, or if you are going to change, they're a good way to get a baseline as to what's now, and now they can help you assess the change in that management program. And that's really, where they're good, and why sometimes people will just pull a random Haney test and say, I don't know what this means, it does nothing for me. They're tools that help you over space and time. They're tools that help you compare to what you're doing or not doing. So the other thing, so that's Haney's a good one. Again, the lab I use out of California, Denell, they run a respiration test too. That's really good. And then Cornell runs a good one. Midwest Labs runs the Haney test. You can get these now many, many, many places. The other thing you're going to get with a Haney test is when I first started out, I talked about a soil test, and I talked about like a water extract. With the Haney test, they have a weak extract. They call it an H3A extract. It's a weak extract, and that's kind of what they're trying to do too. They're trying to look at a soil through a very weak organic acid, kind of like they're trying to mimic what your roots are doing. Your roots are excreting very weak organic acids, and that's how they etch and break bonds in the soil and get minerals available. So when we take a standard soil test, that's a strong acid. That's just ripping things apart. So with the Haney, you're also getting a weak acid exit, and it's got everything: calcium, magnesium, potassium, all the micronutrients. So they're trying to give you that look. So I have some people who have a standard tissue or a soil test, and then they use the Haney because they get the respiration, the carbon, and they kind of get that modified look at what's going to be more available. Again, the Haney test is one of those. It is $50, but you get actually quite a bit for the $50 if you utilize everything that it's offering. And then from there, the other things you can do is now there is DNA sequencing. So that's something that even 4 or 5 years ago would have cost thousands of dollars to run out here, where now there are labs that for $150 to $200 we can DNA sequence your blocks. Still very expensive, still not cheap, But what that's going to do is really dig down deep into what microbes are there, not just how many bacteria, but what bacteria, and it's going to go to species. And then some of the labs that are doing this, they're also trying to give you more than, well, wow, you have 5,000 different bacterial species. What they're doing is just saying, well, the dominant bacterial species is a nitrogen fixer. So you should have good potential for nitrogen fixation. So that's the power of that. If you want to spend the money, you get some insight into what your microbiome might be either good at or bad at. So you might have the microbes that really release phosphorus just might not be there. Well, that is a powerful thing to know, because I'm going to have to rely much more on phosphorus fertilization to supply the fertilizer. It's also a powerful tool, again, if you want to use compost, cover crops, biological products. If I know my soil, because I've analyzed it, doesn't release
Hang on,
phosphorus.
everybody. I'm sure they'll be right back.
Are we gone again?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I lost connection.
Okay. So if we've analyzed
Yeah, we can
our
see you
soil-
now. Thank you.
If we've analyzed our soil and we know it to be lacking on phosphorus solubilizers, but now we go and we add compost and we come back a year or two later and redo the analysis, and that's improved, again, it's a way to track, wow, that is making a difference. Because the problem with compost, cover crops, some of these biologicals, it might not affect yield instantly. It might take 2 years or 3 years to affect yield. So what we want to do is be able to still be able to scientifically with data say, well, it's not affecting yield, but we're seeing positive movement. And we know if that positive movement is happening long enough, it's going to affect yield at some point. But a lot of times what we do is we bail out of good things, good practices before we should, because we're just not seeing the results, and there's no way to measure it besides what goes in the bins, in the buckets. So that's why I like this testing. That's why I use a lot of it with the people I work with. Is we're always just trying to make sure if we're going to invest in a practice, is it improving somehow, somewhere? And typically, and I do see this in wine grapes as I see it everywhere, what we'll see is we'll see improvements in usually quality first, and then you'll see improvements in yield. So first the numbers on the test will move, and then a year later, maybe 2 years later, we'll see quality improve, and then usually yield responds. But especially on a perennial, it takes a while, because what we did this year isn't going to show up at best till next year. So there's all this delay. So I like to have the data, because it lets me stick with the delay. Or more importantly, if for some reason we were pretty sure this was going to help, and the data just keeps coming back where it's not, something else is a limiting factor. And now we can look elsewhere and figure out what it is. So DNA sequencing is definitely becoming in better reach. The other microbial test you can take, which is kind of in between. So if you don't want to go as crazy as DNA sequencing, but you want a little more detail than respiration, is a PLFA test. So that's a phospholipid fatty acid test. So everybody, we have phospholipid biomarkers in us, so do microbes, and that's what they're doing. They're using that phospholipid as a biomarker to analyze what microbes are in your soil. So they go a little down deeper. They don't go to species, but they're going to tell you how much bacteria is in your soil and how much fungi. And then they're going to give you a ratio. So it can help tell you, are you bacterially dominant or are you fungally dominant? And it goes a little deeper than that. They're going to tell you if you're gram-positive, gram-negative on bacteria. They're going to tell you if you're mycorrhizal fungi or saprophilic fungi. Question?
That sounds like something that'd be valuable if you're seriously into making your own compost.
Yes. So I love PLFAs, but I don't. Respiration is something I can use as a tool alongside a soil test to build a fertility program. PLFA is really, it's only good when I'm comparing directly. So yes, I love it if I'm going to build compost or apply compost. I can use a PLFA where I applied and I didn't apply and really see some things. If I'm gonna plant half the field in a cover crop, or I'm gonna have half the field sod and half the field tilled, then when we have these side-by-side comparisons, PLFA is a powerful tool. It also tells us about protozoa, so it helps us kind of understand maybe some nutrient cycling that's going on or not. And then there's all kinds of other things that PLFA will do, but those are kind of the highlights. But that is a good one. Price is somewhere in the middle. You're going to spend probably $80 on a PLFA test. So it's kind of in the middle. It's usually one that I don't kind of point growers to unless, again, they come to me and say, hey, I want to do a side-by-side with this biological or this compost, then it's great. But it doesn't give us as much insight as to, well, now how do I tweak my nitrogen program? So that's where I kind of lean on the Haney's, the respirations, Cornell, the Cornell soil health test will do something similar. And then you can get, you can actually buy respiration tools for out in your soil. Those can be good too. I don't recommend them. If you go with a lab, you can get help. So you can call people like me, but usually the labs that are doing this work have people there that'll answer questions. And they're not going to be able to get you deep in the weeds, but they're going to get you down the road of what you need to know. So that's really the good place to start, and then from there you can seek out more. How are we doing on time?
Very
Nobody
good.
even told me
We
how
have
long
time.
we're going.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so is there any questions? We just covered a lot of ground quickly. Does
Yeah,
anybody have?
Our virtual attendees also, they are very quiet. Yeah, so you can just, if you're not comfortable to unmute yourself, you can chat. I mean, just put your question in the question part. Yep, I will read it.
So I'll just kind of recap real quick. Usually we start with a soil test. That's the place to start. That's always the place to start. But I'm going to tell you right now, that's not enough if you really want to drive quality and yield. I'll say it that way here because in wine grapes, that's what we want. We want quality first, yield second. The other thing I'll say about wine grapes is it's one of those crops where, to me, balance is really important. So when we're talking about a crop that we really want to balance, now I want more data. So that soil test is going to be the place I start, but I'm going to need more data to figure out how I can make sure my plant's getting what it needs when it needs. So from that soil test, like I said, my next step is I always go towards, I want to see some kind of water extract. I want to see what's available in the soil. And you'll be surprised how many times something like calcium is just not available. Well, that's a really good place to start, because if we don't have available calcium in the soil, a lot of good things that should be happening aren't happening. If you read any book out there that talks about calcium, not everything they say, but most things they say about what calcium's doing for you as something that's flocculating your soil, that's improving microbial activity, that's acting as a plant secondary messenger. Those are all things that calcium does do, but only soluble calcium. So if that calcium is locked up in your soil, and even though it's there, if it's not available to the plant, none of those things are happening. And yes, we can foliar spray calcium, and that can limp us through. But the calcium is one of those immobile nutrients that needs to come through the roots. So we need a soil test to tell us how much is there, because that's important. Because if I don't have enough, I have to use a soil amendment to get the numbers up. So now I got a lime or I got to use gypsum. So it's going to help me know, do I need a soil amendment? But once I apply that soil amendment, that still doesn't mean it's available. Getting the numbers up will help availability, but it might not take it all the way there because of my unique soil type, my unique microbiome. So then, if my extract is still telling me I'm low, it helps me make a decision. Do I need now to go a step further and add a calcium fertilizer, something that's soluble, that's going to get into the plant. So that's why I use those two together. One takes me so far, the next one takes me a step farther. From there, I can follow up with a tissue test, whether it be sap or leaf blade or petiole. Hopefully it's sap or leaf blade with a petiole. But then that's going to be a further report card on, okay, we amended the soil, we fertilized the soil, now what? Did it really get in there? So that's really important. And those are kind of the three. And then, like I said, I tend to then, the next one I go to is a respiration test. And I'm doing that because I just want general knowledge of what my microbial biomass is doing, its activity, but more importantly, it's going to help me dial in nitrogen, which is a real big key, especially if quality is of importance, because if I don't have enough nitrogen, I'm not going to have good quality. Starving your plant of nitrogen is not the answer to good quality. The plant's going to struggle to photosynthesize right, it's going to struggle to be productive and have really good quality fruit. But if I have too much nitrogen, I'm going to dilute the other nutrients. I'm going to water it down. I'm going to potentially bring in more disease pressure and pest pressure because I have free nitrates moving around. I'm not converting to protein the way I should. I'm going to have nitrates, and those are the calling cards to diseases. It's what they want. It's the food they want. So my disease susceptibility is going to go up. Well, now I have to spend more money on protective chemistry. So getting nitrogen right is really important. And then to take it a step further, if I'm looking at these tissue tests and I'm getting a better level of zinc and copper, the one thing I will say real quick is there's a lot of good tissue tests out there. All of them are good. Just about any consultant can teach you how to read them. The one I really lean on, it's going to sound like I'm plugging this lab, but the one I lean on is out of California, Denell Analytical. And there's a reason why I use that one in particular, and why I usually have growers use it, is they give you sufficiency data. It's important. Where's my nitrogen? Where's my potassium? But they take it a step further and they look at all those nutrients in relationship to themselves. So I want to know what nitrogen is in the plant, but the plant doesn't just see nitrogen in and of itself. The plant only sees nitrogen in the context of all the other minerals. And all minerals, they're all antagonistic. So this is all based on research that Purdue University did, so it's not that it's this lab's data, it's just the data they used from Purdue. And what Purdue did is they created algorithms where they can look at nitrogen in relationship to zinc, nitrogen in relationship to potassium, and so on and so forth. And they do that for all the different nutrients. So, and then they rank it. So you might have adequate nitrogen, but because something else is so high or so low, the plant's need for nitrogen went up. And what the test is going to tell you is your nitrogen's bad, and it gives you basically a positive and a negative number. So if it's good, you get a positive number. If it's bad, it's a negative. And the bigger the negative number, the bigger the problem. So why do I like that? I like that just because in a glance, you can see what your biggest limiting factor is. And that's when we're talking about plants and yield and quality, we have to identify the biggest limiting factors first. When we're talking about ROI, if I spend money on this, do I get that money back? Well, again, biggest limiting factor. So for example, my nitrogen might be a little low. Let's say my nitrogen's a -7. Okay, it's a little low. Maybe I could add some nitrogen. Maybe my potassium's a -12. Well, that's a little low too. Maybe I could add a little. But I go down the list and my zinc and my boron are -80, -100. Well, those are much bigger problems. So instead of going out and buying a bunch of nitrogen and trying to fix that little nitrogen issue, I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend money on zinc. And what you'll find a lot of times is when we fix the biggest limiting factor, the other things that were slightly out of balance will just come into balance, and we didn't have to spend that money. So it really helps me as a consultant advise on what to do. But even if I'm not there, why I like this test is it's easy for even any grower at any level, you can look at that and it's easy. That's a big negative number. Maybe I should do something about it. So it kind of paints the picture of these are your limiting factors. You know, either do something about it now, or at the very least, know about it. Go good for research. They're not really good for building a fertility program. So those are the ones that I use. I'd be more than happy if anybody wants to talk further about them. You can get a hold of me. If you want to see examples of them, I can send you examples. Or I can just give you the websites of where you can find these tests, like Denell Analytical. Regen Ag Labs is where I go for a lot of my Haney tests, but Midwest Labs also does Haney tests. Obviously Cornell Soil Health Labs does Cornell stuff, but there's many others. Any other questions?
When you find deficiencies, are you looking at foliar or ground? What's your...
Yep, good question. So it kind of depends. A
Sorry,
lot of
could you-
times...
Could you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, good. I'll repeat the question. So he said, when we find deficiencies, what do? Are we addressing it more through the ground soil or foliar? And it kind of depends. It's with micronutrients like zinc, I tend to fix that much more through foliar. If it's a macronutrient, I tend to go more through the ground. And that's a generalization, and there's some crossover and carryover. But what we find is, what I've found over time is, I can throw a lot of zinc sulfate at the soil, but a lot of times I don't see a lot of change. And sometimes my soil test doesn't change much, but even if my soil tests change, it still doesn't get into the plant. So when I foliar, I know I get it into the plant, and I don't have interaction. So when I put it in the soil, now it's competing with all the other stuff. So I know I don't have those interactions. The problem though with the leaf is I can only get so much through the leaf. So when it's a micronutrient and I'm just trying to change it at parts per million, I can do a lot of change through the leaf. When it's potassium and it needs pounds per acre, usually I really can't physically get enough through the leaf to make a difference. So it's about the soil, and I'm really only using foliar potassium for more physiological stuff. So I'm going to use foliar potassium not to fix my potassium issue in the soil. That I'm going to fix in the soil. But if I'm going into harvest and my bricks are low because maybe it's been dry, I'm going to spray foliar potassium to just in that space and time get potassium up and move sugars. So I look at macronutrient foliars, more to change something, small bumps, and it's more about physiology. Where zinc, I can make major changes with foliars, and sometimes in the soil it doesn't. It's not as linear. It's much easier to spread potassium, see it on the soil test, and see it load into the tissue. It's really tricky with zinc, with manganese, with iron. So I tend to kind of do it that way. It was a good question though. Any other questions?
We have a question from one of our Zoom participants. Can you hear me okay, RJ?
Yes, I can.
Okay. It's a pH question from a homeowner with 24 bare root marquette vines in the ground at 45 days. The soil test of untreated soil before planting showed all the areas over optimal with pH at 7.2. After planting with only 16 of 24 showing any sign of growth, soil amendments made, and even though it's too early to test, I suppose, cheap single prong pH tester reads either 5.0 or 5.5 for each of the 24 locations. The tester doesn't seem to read anything other than 0.5 day increments. More importantly, at what point should I just stop amending the soil and wait for a time in the future to further test? Keep in mind I'm trying, almost desperate, to figure out why these vines are not growing. P.S. All of the non-growing vines show green on a trunk scratch test.
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of over-the-counter, buy your own pH testers and things like that. You really want to go to a lab, and I can go on for days on why you do, but I wouldn't trust that. And when we amend soil, yeah, at this point, you know, knowing what little I know, but when we amend soil, a lot of these soil amendments do take time. So we don't want to just keep amending. We really want to amend and leave it alone for a while, come back and test, see where we're at. Because we can get to a spot where if we're amending too often in between testing, we can overdo it. And you're always better to underdo it than overdo it. I can always add more. It's really hard to take back. So in this situation, I would not worry about your over-the-counter pH testing strip. I would send in another sample to a good lab. Not all labs do this, but I like to have a 1-to-1 soil pH. That's what most labs do. They do that because that's kind of what most universities use. But I also like to use a water pH. If a lab does a water pH, do a water pH with it. I like it better than a buffered pH. And the water pH will be buffered, but it's just buffered differently. Why you do that is you're going to get a better look into a couple things. One, you know, what the pH is at that soil level, but that's not what the plant sees. The plant really sees a water pH test because that's what's happening right then, right there. The other problem with a 1-to-1 soil pH is they make the mixture, they probe it. So sulfur in your soil is going to release real quick, change the pH dramatically. Calcium releases slower. So if we have a soil that has a lot of calcium in it, sometimes your pH actually is a lot higher than what a 1-to-1 will read. So your 1-to-1 will read 5.5, but really your soil, your plant is seeing it more as a 6.5. So especially with new plants like that, and this person, if you want, I can tell you what labs do that. I would get a new soil test. I would get it with a lab where I can have a water and a soil pH, and kind of stop amending and give it some time. Give those amendments some time to work. At this point, don't do anything more through the soil. If your vines are still looking bad, this is where we talk about foliar, to just kind of limp things along through the growing season. I'd love to discuss that more. If you've got further questions, email me, call me, and we can go a little deeper into that. I'm not sure where to look or who to look at, so I'm just kind of looking all over the place.
That's the camera.
That's a good point. Could you share your email and I will put it in the chat for our Zoom participants?
Yes. So I've got a few different emails that RJ ran at Nutrilink Biosystems, but since we're in this kind of venue, my easiest email is just rjrant, so that's rjrant @gmail.com. That's the easiest one.